So hopefully everyone should see politically exposed persons there. So I think we'll start just by saying thank you for everybody for coming in again. I'm Mike Kelly and this is Atta McGregor, and we founded 2Shakes a long time ago. And we, as part of the platform for doing customer due diligence for AML, politically exposed person checks come up a lot. And then recently, when we started doing audits for some of our customers, we found that there's a great deal of confusion about PEP checks out there. So what we wanted to do is just run this little webinar, sort of 15 minutes to half an hour, depending on how many questions there are, and just dispel a few myths and make it as simple and practical as possible so that you guys know what you need to do to be compliant and how to do it. So that's really what today is about. So what we're going to cover, why PEP checks are necessary, when you should do a PEP check, the step-by-step of actually doing a PEP check, if there's a hit, what the report actually tells you, and what to do if you do get a hit, because there's some additional things, and then we'll kind of crack into our Q&A. So why are PEP checks necessary? So in the AML-CFT Act, Section 26 says that PEP checks are required. You are required to do a PEP check on every customer or beneficial owner of a customer in order to ensure that they're not a politically exposed person. Now, it's a foreign politically exposed person, and the foreign side of that has been interpreted as meaning foreign individuals, and that's not what the legislation says. The legislation says that the person has held a politically exposed position in an overseas country. So that could easily have been me or your neighbor or somebody returning from overseas because of COVID. They could easily have been holding a politically exposed position in a foreign jurisdiction. Just because they're a Kiwi, they've got a Kiwi driver license, Kiwi passport, it doesn't mean that they wouldn't meet the threshold for being a PEP. So you have to check every customer, every beneficial owner of your customer. And as we've mentioned there, with a lot of Kiwis returning home just now, it's even more important than ever to make sure that you're doing it. But obviously it's in the legislation, so you just got to do it. So when a PEP check should be done. This is a little bit funny. When you do customer due diligence on a customer, you have to do all your identity checks before you start a business relationship with your customer. The legislation is a bit funny. It says with the PEP check, you have to ensure that they're not a politically exposed person as soon as practicable after establishing the business relationship. Which we think, yeah, that's fine. What it does mean is if you go into a business relationship with somebody, you start doing in-scope services, and then you find out they're a PEP, then it gets a little bit gnarly. So what we've always done is we've added in the PEP check as part of the electronic ID. But if you haven't been doing them and you've been doing manual, there's still the opportunity to do the PEP checks if you've been missing out on them. So we recommend doing a PEP check up front, and that's what I was just saying. If there's a hit, you know, that is immediately cause for concern. You need to escalate that to senior management. You need to decide if you're going to establish that business relationship. But being a PEP actually triggers enhanced due diligence. You have to do EDD if senior management decide that you're going to do that, have that business relationship. And that means getting source of wealth or proof of funds from your client. And that's a difficult conversation if you've already started that business relationship. So doing it up front is what we would always recommend. And as I mentioned there, 2Shakes, we include the PEP check as part of an electronic ID. So with that electronic ID verification, we're doing the identity through a driver license or passport, we're doing the address verification, and we're doing the PEP check all electronically. If you've done manual CDD, and you haven't done the PEP checks, you can still go back and sort them out. And very importantly, if your program, your AML program says, we will only do PEP checks on foreign individuals, then you need to review that, because that's not going to be compliant with the legislation. You need to do PEP checks on all your customers and all your beneficial owners of your customers.
It's a common mistake.
Yeah, that is common. So what we're going to do now is just have a look at sort of 3 ways that we can do PEP checks. And I kind of mentioned a couple of them, but hopefully this will be really useful for you. So the first part of it is just as part of the electronic IDV in 2Shakes. The next part is if you're just doing a PEP for a manual ID, or if you've got a whole bunch of people that you haven't PEP checked and it's all a bit of a hassle, you can actually do it in bulk. And I will say as well, while the PEP check or the electronic ID verification requires consent, to do a PEP check, you don't need a client consent. So as long as you've got the information to do the PEP check, you can just run the PEP check without asking them. So that's really handy if you've already done a manual ID, you didn't do the PEP check, you don't have to go back to your client, you can just enter the data. So this is what the 2Shakes electronic ID selection would look like. As soon as you select the electronic ID, we're doing that PEP check as part of it. And any clients or beneficial owners that you've done an electronic ID on, the PEP check has been done. So, and that's really why we bundled it with that. It happens up front. So if there is a hit, you know beforehand, you can do all of that stuff up front. You don't have to worry about it finding out down the line. So we would always recommend going with an electronic ID because for the sake of $5, it's going to save you a heap of time and an awful lot of hassle further down the line. So that's the electronic ID in 2Shakes. If you've done a manual ID, you know, we've got, you'll know that there's that little box that says manual, click manual ID be done, and you come into this screen for IDV actions. You can say that the manual IDV has been done, you've added all of the information into 2Shakes, but then you can tell 2Shakes about PEP check. And you can, if you tick the PEP check box, you can enter the person's name, address, date of birth, name and date of birth, and say go. And we will do an electronic PEP check there and then. It costs $2.50, and we will do that PEP check, the one that's included in the electronic ID. And that will happen instantaneously, and you'll get either a clear or a hit straight away. If you've done a PEP check outside of 2Shakes, it's still a good idea to load up all of that documentary evidence or the evidence of the PEP check that you've done into notes and files, and then mark the PEP check as already checked. And that's really just so that 2Shakes can see that you've done it, and when your auditor comes along, they can see you've done it, and you'll know that your information is in notes and files. So that's doing it manually. And then the last part is if you've got a whole bunch of people that you haven't PEP checked. We've got a cat coming in. That's awesome. We got if you've got a whole bunch of people that you haven't PEP checked, and you don't want to go through all of that bit in 2Shakes and put all the data in individually, you might have a spreadsheet of your clients, and you want to get a bulk load done. We've got a spreadsheet that we can send through to you. Are we making that available? Yep. Yeah. So we've got a spreadsheet that we can make available to you. You just put in the information, and that might be an export and copy from your CRM system or whatever. Send it through to us, and we will run those PEP checks. It will still cost the same, but we will take care of all of that bulk uploading for you. So that's the other option that you have. I'd also just mention, for those of you that have been through the Centrix and DIA forms so that you can do electronic IDs on passports, you can do a PEP check directly in the 2Shakes Centrix portal. And you can, even if you did this, rather than sending it to us, you can upload it directly in their portal. But feel free to send it to us as well. Either way is going to get the result. So what the PEP report tells you, if there is a hit, then there's a report. And I just probably want to move these slides around. I might just jump to this one. Okay. So if there's a hit, what you want to do is, you'll see it as a hit in 2Shakes, contact us and we will get you the report. So the PEP report will tell you a bunch of things. I'm going to show you what the report looks like now. Sorry. The report is going to have any aliases that the person has, the addresses, any sanctions, or the reason that they're a PEP. Now, the thing to remember is the PEP check, which checks for politically exposed positions, we also check for sanctions, whether the person has done something naughty and done some financial crime or other types of crime. And there'll be sanctions against them, and they'll show up as a hit then too. And that really is good for informing you whether or not you want to do business with it.
I would say that the sanctions bit gets hit more often than the politically exposed one. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, and sometimes it can be a surprise, and sometimes it's, we'll talk about that in a minute.
So if someone's done serious fraud or something, some sort of criminal activity, that'll hit.
Yeah. or if, you know, if they're an actual PEP in a foreign jurisdiction, such as, you know, being a Supreme Court judge over in the UK, or a High Court judge, or they've been running a state-owned enterprise in Australia, then that's going to be a politically exposed position. So it will tell you the sanctions or the reasons of politically exposed political positions, any linked businesses and any linked persons. So
the linked persons bit is important because the Section 26 of the Act asks for people related to that person as well.
Yeah, so you're doing the PEP check on the person and anyone who's immediately related to them. So here's an example. Now, we asked our provider for an example PEP check that we could share with people, and this is what they sent through. So that was their choice. Everybody knows Osama bin Laden, and this would be because of the sanctions, although I suppose he would have held a politically exposed position too, just not in the last 12 months. So what this would tell you is some information about him, and this is the report that we would send through to you. Some information about the person, you know, any aliases, and obviously he's got quite a few aliases. Not every report is going to be as long as this. He's got a couple of aliases there. Their addresses, the sanctions and political positions that they have held, so the reason why it's been a PEP hit. Any notes, and that might be if it's like, say, a sanction for financial crime, it would have, say, the UK, a UK entry from a database from the British government saying that they had done something, or it would say they spent several years in an American penitentiary. It would just have various notes, the reason why that those sanctions had come. Any linked businesses, which is very useful, because sometimes those are going to throw up other areas for you to consider with the person that you're dealing with. And any linked persons. And that might be why you're getting the hit, is the person might be a linked person to a politically exposed person. So that's what the report would tell you. So this is what you would do if you get one. So obviously, as I said, you contact 2Shakes and we will get the report and give it to you. It could be a false match, and I have to say, in general, it mostly is. Okay, so we always say to people, the first thing to do is make sure, discuss it with your client and find out whether or not this person is the person they're talking about, because you can get a false hit. The best example of that is we try and do a search on an exact match, and so you can get the report coming back saying this is an exact match, but it's an exact match often on a limited set of data. So if, for instance, Dave Smith was going to be your client and he was born on the 1st of June 1970, and you did a PEP check, the American penal system might have a Dave Smith who spent 2 years in prison, but he was born in 1970, and that's the only piece of data that they have on him, Dave Smith 1970. So they return that as an exact match. It doesn't mean it was the Dave Smith that was born on the 1st of June 1970, but it will still say it's an exact match based on the limited set of data they have. So always find out whether or not this is your client. If it is your client, then there's a couple of things you need to do. One, because it's a hit, in 2Shakes, you know that in the CDD records, you can tick that it's a PEP against that person or the client they're a beneficial owner of. Then you know you're dealing with a PEP, and that's going to trigger it as being enhanced due diligence. That's the first part. Now, the legislation doesn't just say you have to do enhanced normally, like you would if it was a trust with your client or if it was high risk. With a PEP, you have to escalate it to senior management, and senior management have to discuss it and make a decision as to whether or not they're going to continue and take on this client or not, and record that decision in your notes and files in 2Shakes, whether you're going forward or whether you're not going forward. So it's a senior management decision. It's not just something that somebody can say, oh yeah, it's enhanced due diligence, let's plow on with source of wealth. There needs to be a decision by the senior management. If you decide to proceed, you will need to get the source of wealth, obviously. And so that you know, when you do your 2Shakes AML statistics, any PEP hits where you've ticked the PEP box, not just a potential hit from the ID verification, but where you've gone in and said it's a confirmed PEP and you've ticked the PEP box, they will be counted on your AML statistics when you run them, and that's from the AML tab at the top of the page. And that should hopefully help on PEP checks.